Chapter 25 of 6 Feet 4 by Jackson Gregory. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25 In the Dark. It was a pitch-black night, the stars hidden by dense drifting clouds, and intensely still. Buck Thornton and Two-Hand Billy Comstock, riding side by side with few words, turned straight out across the fields, the marshal reining his horse close into that other horse he could scarcely see and leaving to the cowboy the task of finding their way. They rode slowly until they turned into the level country road, and then swifter that they might come into Hill's Corners before it was midnight. When at last the twinkling lights of Dead Man's Alley winked at them, Comstock struck a match and looked at his watch. 15 minutes of 12, he said. You're on time. And I guess you can do the rest of your riding alone? So long. I'm apt to drop in on you at the ranch any day. Comstock had planned to ride straight to the Brown Bear Saloon, to invest in a stack of chips and to spend the evening seeing the town. And Thornton, understanding that if the note from Winifred Waverly were truthful in all that it said, and in all that it suggested, it would be as well if he were not seen tonight, turning out along the outskirts of the village to come to Pollard's house without riding through the main street. "Easy, Comet, easy," he muttered to his horse, having no desire to come to the appointed place before the appointed hour. "We've got 15 minutes, and then won't have to keep the lady waiting. If she's there, Comet." For even yet his suspicions were not all at rest. Already he rode with reins and quirt in the grip of his left hand, the right caught in the loose band of his chaps. It lacked but a few minutes of midnight when he entered the dark, silent street in which was Henry Pollard's house. Here were a few straggling houses with many vacant lots between, and no single light to show that any were awake, no gleam from a window to cut through the darkness which was absolute. Thornton drew his horse to the side of the road where the grass had not been worn away by the wheels of wagons, and where the animals' footfalls were muffled, hardly to be heard a score of paces away. Twice he stopped, frowning into the gloom about him, seeking to force his eyes to penetrate the impenetrable wall of the dark, straining his ears to catch some little sound through the silence. But there was nothing to see save the black forms of houses and the pear trees in Pollard's yard, shapeless, sinister shadows, something darker than the emptiness against which they stood. No sound save his horse's breathing, the faint creak of his own saddle leather, the low jingle of bridle and spur chain. "Almost too still to be true," he told himself. "But," with a grim tightening of his lips, "too infernally dark for a man to pick me off with a shotgun if he wanted to." 50 yards from Pollard's front gate he stopped his horse, swung down noiselessly from the saddle, and tied Comet to a tree standing at the edge of the road. His jingling spurs he removed to hang them over the horn of his saddle. Then he went forward on foot, walking guardedly, his tread upon the grass making no sound to reach his own ears, and came to Pollard's gate. It was so dark under the pear trees that the obscurity was without detail. He must guess rather than know where the tree trunks were. It was hard to judge if they were 10 feet or 50 feet from him. There might be no one here to keep tryst with him, while on the other hand a dozen men might be waiting. For perhaps 2 or 3 minutes he waited, standing motionless at the gate. No faint noise came to him, no hint of a shadow stirring among those other shadows as motionless as they were formless. The night seemed not to breathe, no sound even of rustling branches coming to his ears from the old pear trees. "It's 12 o'clock, and after," he thought. "If she's coming she ought to be here now." Still he waited. And then when he knew it must be 10 or 15 minutes after the time Winifred had set, and remembering that she said specifically, "under the pear trees," he moved forward suddenly, jerked the gate open, and stood in Pollard's yard. The little noise of the gate whining upon its worn hinges sounded unnaturally loud. His footfall upon the warped board walk which led to the front door snapped through the silence like a pistol shot. "If there's anybody laying for me here, he knows now that I've come," he told himself. And with no hesitation now, yet with no lessening of his watchfulness, he came on swiftly until he stood under the pear trees and within 10 feet of the front porch. It was still about him, intensely still and black dark. He stood leaning forward a little, peering into the darkness, listening for a sound, any sound. He knew that it must be 12:30, that for close upon half an hour he had waited here. Half an hour filled with quick, conflicting thoughts, suggesting a dozen explanations. Was the note really from Miss Waverly? Had she acted in good faith in sending it? What was the danger of which she spoke? Why had she not come, and why had she set an hour like this? Was it a mere hoax? "If I could only have a smoke," he muttered, "it wouldn't be so bad waiting to see what the play is." But still he waited, determined not to leave until possessed of the certainty of there being no need of staying longer. Cautiously he approached the house until he could have put his foot to the first of the steps, leading up to the little porch. There he stopped, telling himself that doubtless he was just playing Tom Fool here in his enemy's garden. Less and less did he like the idea of prowling about the place of Henry Pollard at this time of night. But now at last there was a sound to vibrate against the empty silence in his ears, a little sound which at first he could not analyze and could not locate. He could hardly be sure whether his senses had tricked him or if he actually heard it. It seemed rather that he had felt it. His body grew very tense as he tried to know where it was, what it was. But again the silence was heavier and more oppressive than before. At last, through the void of the absolute stillness, it came again. Now he knew what it was, although not even yet could he be certain whence it came. It was a cautious step. It might have been a man's step or a woman's. No muscle of his rigid body moved, save alone the muscles which turned his eyes to right and left. At first he thought that there was someone moving toward him from behind, someone who had perhaps just come in through the gate, or had been hidden in the straggling shrubbery. And the next instant he knew that the sounds were in front of him, that what he heard was someone walking in the house, tiptoeing cautiously, and yet not silently, because the old boards of the floor whined and creaked under the slow tread. Had the night been less still, had his ears been less ready for any sounds, the faint creak would have not reached him. Woman or man, was his problem. Winifred Waverly or Henry Pollard? There came a second sound, and this he recognized. The scraping of dry wood against dry wood, the moving of the bars which the countryside knew that Henry Pollard used as the night lock upon his doors. Thornton drew back a little, step by step, slowly, silently, and stopped under the pear trees. Now he was 10 feet from the first of the front steps, 10 feet from the boardwalk. When a man must trust everything to his ears for guidance, His ears may tell him much. Thornton knew when the bars were down and when the door was opening very slowly. And then, suddenly, he knew that there was a third person out here in the garden close to him, and that this person, man or woman, was moving with as great a slow caution as himself and the other someone in the house. There was the crack of a twig snapping underfoot. Silence. Slow, cautious steps again. The cowboy moved again, a bare 2 steps now, and stopped, his back against the trunk of the largest of the pear trees, his eyes running back and forth between the door he could not see and the moving someone he could not see at the corner of the house. His widened nostrils had stiffened, as though he would scent out these beings, and his eyes were the alert eyes of an animal in the forest seeking its enemy through the denseness of a black undergrowth. The door was open, the soft step was at the threshold. The other step at the corner of the house had stopped. In the new silence the cowboy could hear his own deep, regular breathing. He could see nothing. He knew that his body pressed against the tree trunk could not be seen, and his hands were ready. He began to long for a pistol shot, for the spurt of red fire, for anything that would mean certainty and would release the coiled springs of his tense muscles. But the still minutes dragged by, and there was no certainty of anything save that the someone at the door and the someone at the corner of the house at Thornton's right were standing as still, as tense as himself. A little sense of the grim humor of this game 3 people were playing in the dark, this blind man's bluff, which he was waiting to understand, drew his lips into a quick fleeting smile. Now at last came the first bit of certainty. The someone at the door moved again, came to the steps and down into the garden, taking the steps slowly, with long pauses between. This someone was a man. Dimly Thornton saw the blur of the form, but more than his eyes and ears told him that this tread, though guarded, was too heavy for a girl like Winifred Waverly. "Pollard," he told himself swiftly. "Not 10 feet away. And if he comes this way—" The man at the steps stopped, and in the long silence Thornton knew that the 2 other people playing this grim game with him were listening even as he was, trying to force their eyes to see through the shadows. Then the heavy tread again, and Thornton thought that it was coming nearer. Then a pause, the step once more, and Pollard, if Pollard it were, had turned the other way and keeping close to the house was moving toward the far corner. The steps grew fainter as they drew farther away, and he knew that the man had gone around the corner of the building. That other person at the other corner of the house, at Thornton's right, had heard and understood too. The cowboy heard steps there again, quick steps, almost running, soft, quick breathing not a yard away, and bending forward a little, knew that Winifred Waverly had come to keep her tryst with him. "Miss Waverly?" he whispered softly. She was at his side, close to him, so close that he could feel the sweep of her skirts against his boots. She, too, had leaned forward, her face lifted up to his, her eyes seeking to make sure who this man was. "Buck Thornton?" she whispered back. "Yes, what is it?" "Here, quick." She had thrust a folded paper into his fingers, closing them tightly upon it. "Now go! Do what I tell you in it. Henry Pollard suspects something. He is looking for me. Go quickly!" She was already passing him, hastening toward the steps and the front door. "Wait!" he commanded, his hand hard upon her arm. I don't understand." "For God's sake, let me go." Only a whisper, but he thought he heard a quiver of terror in it. He knew that her arm was trembling violently. "He'd kill me. Oh, my God, go!" "If there is danger for you—" "There is none if you go now, if he doesn't find me here. Please, Buck." She jerked away from him and went swiftly to the steps. He could hear her every step now so plainly his heart stood still with fear that Pollard must hear too. He heard her go to the door. She passed on and so became one with the blot of darkness within the house. Then he drew back, slowly, half regretfully, back toward the gate, stopping for a last time under the trees there. And after a very long time he heard Pollard's steps again. The man had made a tour of his grounds, keeping rather close to the house, and now mounted the steps with no effort at silence, slammed the door and dropped the bars into place. It was as though he had flung them angrily into their sockets. Thornton went out of the yard and to his waiting horse. "She says to go away, to leave her there, alone with Pollard," he muttered dully, "and something's up. She said he'd kill her if he knew that she was talking to me." He hesitated, his horse's tie rope in his hand, of half a mind to go back, to force his way into Henry Pollard's house, to demand to know what was wrong, to take the girl away if there were real danger to her. But then the urgent pleading in her voice came back to him, her insistence that he go, that with him gone there would no longer be any danger for her. Slowly, regretfully, he swung into the saddle. He had made up his mind. He would obey her at least in part. He would go where he could read the paper she had given him, and then perhaps he would understand. "Anyway," he said under his breath, "she's a real girl for you." He rode swiftly the 500 yards through the dark street which ran as nearly parallel with the main street as two such crooked streets could approximate parallelism, until he was behind the Here's How saloon. Here he dismounted and, leaving his horse with reins thrown over his head to the ground, strode off toward the side door of the saloon. Under the window he glanced in swiftly. Chance had it that the cover was off of the little used billiard table and that two men, in shirt-sleeved comfort, were playing. Both men he knew. They were Charlie Bedloe and his brother, the Kid. The Bedloe boys were intent upon their game, the Kid laughing softly at a miscue Charlie had made. Charlie was chalking his cue angrily and cursing his luck, and neither of them glanced toward the window. Thornton, drawing back a little so that he could not be seen, did they happen to look his way, unfolded the paper Winifred had given him. "Watch me play out my string, Charlie," he heard the Kid call banteringly. Then he heard nothing more from the room, nothing to tell him of another man not 10 steps from him in the darkness, for his whole mind had been caught by Winifred's first words. "I have wronged you from the beginning," she had written. "I thought I had seen you that day on the trail behind me. You denied it. I thought that you were lying to me. While you were out after the horse, a man, masked, came into the cabin and robbed me of the $5,000 I was taking to Henry Pollard. I thought that it was you. The man was dressed as you were dressed. His gray handkerchief even was like yours. Now I know it was a man named Ben Broderick who robbed me, and that he wanted me to think that it was you. Can't you see the whole scheme? Broderick and the men who are with him have been committing these crimes. And pretty soon, in a few days, in 5 days I think, They will be ready to make the evidence show that you are the man who has done it all." There was more. There were several sheets of paper, closely written. Thornton saw the names of Henry Pollard, of Cole Dalton, but he read no further. In one instant the mind which had been so intent upon these things a girl's writing was telling him forgot Winifred Waverly, Henry Pollard, Broderick, everything except that which was happening at his side. For a while he read. There had been the sharp crack of a revolver. He saw the spit of angry reddish flame almost at his side, and as he saw he dropped to his knee, Winifred's note in his left hand, his right flashing to his own revolver. For his first thought was that a man had crept up behind him, that it was Pollard, that he was shooting at him. But almost with the flash and the report of the gun he knew that this man was not shooting at him. There came the crash and tinkle of broken glass. One of the small panes of the window beside which Thornton had been reading dropped out, and almost before the falling pieces had ceased to rattle against the bare floor he heard the sound of running footsteps behind him. The man who had fired had made sure with one shot. Then Thornton heard the Kid cry out, his voice hoarse and inarticulate, and with the cry came a moan from Charley Bedloe. Charley staggered half across the room, his two big hands going automatically to his hips. He had come close to his younger brother, staring at him with wide eyes, and then slipped forward and down, quiet and limp and dead. Thornton's one first emotion, one so natural to a man who takes his fight in the open, was a boundless rage toward the man who had murdered another man in this cold-blooded fashion, taking his grim toll from the darkness, and without warning. He whirled about, his own gun blazing in his hand, and as fast as his finger could work the trigger sent 6 shots after the flying footsteps. The footsteps were gone. Again the cowboy looked swiftly in at the window. He saw that Charley Bedloe was dead. The Kid, his face contorted, hideously twisted to his blended rage and grief, stood staring about him helplessly. Then, the moment of paralysis gone, the Kid suddenly leaped over his brother's body and ran to the window. "It's Buck Thornton!" roared the Kid. Both of his big guns were already in his hands. "Take that, you—" Then Buck Thornton, making most of an unforeseen situation, did a thing that he had never done before in his life, which he never would do again. He turned and ran, stumbling through the darkness into which one leap carried him. For he knew that the Kid had no shadow of a shred of doubt that he had killed Charley Bedloe. He knew that if he did not run for it, run like a scared rabbit now, why then he'd have to kill the Kid, or the Kid would kill him. He had no wish to meet his death for the cowardly act of another man, and he had no wish to kill Kid Bedloe because another man had murdered his brother. If there were anything left to him but to run for it, he did not know what it was. He found his horse, leaped into the saddle, and turned out toward the north. "The Kid sure had his nerve, running right up to the window after Charley dropped," he muttered, with the abrupt beginning of the first bit of admiration he had ever felt for a man whom he had appraised as even lower in the scale than Rattlesnake Pollard. "The boy is game. And now he's going to come out after me, and there won't be any talking done, and it's going to be Kid Bedloe or me." And with much certainty, but with a little sigh, half regretful, "The Kid is just a shade slow on the draw. Sure as 2 and 2 I've got to kill him. Oh, hell!" he concluded disgustedly. "Why did this have to happen? Haven't I got enough on my hands already?" End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of 6 Feet 4 by Jackson Gregory. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. The Frame-Up. Thornton returned to his cabin long before the first faint streak of daylight, and not once during the night did he think of sleep. At his little table in the light of his coal-oil lamp, he read over and over the hurried words which Winifred Waverly had been driven to put on paper for him. At first his look was merely charged with perplexity. Then there came into it incredulity, and finally sheer amazement. "The pack of hounds!" he cried softly when he had done, his fist striking hard upon the table. "The pack of low-down, dirty hounds!" For now, in a flash, he saw and understood beyond the limits to which the girl's vision had gone, grasping explanations denied to her. She had told him everything which she knew or suspected, saying somewhere in her account, "I know now that my first judgment of you, before I was deceived into thinking Ben Broderick you, was right. I know that you are a man and a gentleman. I know that you are square. So now, if you think that you owe me anything for what I am doing for you, I want you to remember that Henry Pollard is my uncle, my dead mother's brother, and to make things no harder for him than he has made them for himself." With no other reference to her relation to the man, with no further hint of a plea for herself, she went on to tell what she knew of Pollard and Broderick, of their meetings with Dalton, whom, she thought, they had completely deceived, of the talk she had overheard that night at the schoolhouse. She said nothing of her own precarious position at Pollard's house. When he finished reading, Buck Thornton's eyes were very bright. "A real woman," he muttered. "A real man sort of girl. I doped her up right at the first jump, and then I went and insulted her by thinking that she was like Rattlesnake Pollard. Lord, Lordy, what a difference!" And then, very gently, his eyes clouding a little, he muttered over and over under his breath, "Poor little kid." But ever his thoughts came back to the tangle into which day by day he himself had been moving deeper and deeper. He saw how simple the whole matter had been, how seemingly sure of success. Broderick was close enough to him in size and form to make the scheme eminently practicable. It was easy for Broderick to dress himself as Thornton dressed, boots, chaps old and worn, big black hat and gray neck handkerchief. It was simple enough for Broderick, here in this land of cattle and horses, to find a horse that would be a fair match for any horse which Thornton rode. He would allow himself to be seen only at a distance, as upon the day Winifred Waverly had seen him, or indistinctly at night, and when the time came and the arrest was made, there would rise up many men to swear to Buck Thornton. Broderick himself had already said that he had been robbed of a can of gold dust. He would be ready to swear that Thornton had robbed him. Pollard would add his word. One by one he remembered episodes which until now had meant nothing. Cattle had been stolen from the ranges all about him. No single cow was missing from the Poison Hole. He had thought that this had been because of his own great vigilance, his night riding over his herds. But what would a jury say? He remembered that the last time he had seen old man King, just a few days ago, when King had remarked dryly upon the fact that no cattle were missing from Thornton's range, There had been a swift look of suspicion in the old cattleman's shrewd eyes. Already he was suspected. How many men besides King were ready to believe the worst of Buck Thornton, a man who had been in their midst only a year? There were many days in the life of Buck Thornton, as in the lives of other cattlemen hereabouts, when he was absolutely alone with his horse, when he rode far out day and night upon some range errand, when, perhaps, he went 2 or 3 days together and saw no other man. Thornton remembered suddenly that when he had first heard of the murder of Bill Varney, the stage driver, he had just returned from such a lonely ride, a 3 days' trip into the mountains to look for new pasture lands. If these men planned to commit these crimes and then to throw the burden upon him, he saw how simple a matter it would be for them to select some such occasion as this when he could not prove an alibi. "They've come mighty close to getting me," he muttered sternly. "Mighty damned uncomfortably close." He saw further. Winifred Waverly had said frankly that she had sworn to the sheriff that she knew it was Buck Thornton who had robbed her. They were managing to hold Cole Dalton off, and they had a reason. What? Perhaps to work their game as long as they dared, to make a last big haul, or to have their chain of evidence welded so strongly link by link that Thornton could not free himself from it, and that no faintest breath of suspicion might reach them. Pollard would be in a position to prove that Thornton had paid him his $5,000 only to take it back. It would give him a chance to break the contract, to regain possession of the Poison Hole, and to keep the other $10,000 already paid in as forfeited. Why had they chosen him to bear the brunt of their manifold crimes? That, too, was clear to him. With him in the penitentiary or gone to the gallows, the whole episode would be closed. The men who had put through their monumental scheme would be in a position to enjoy their boldly acquired profits with no fear of the law so much as searching for them. It was necessary to them that some man suffer for their wrongdoing. Now, why Buck Thornton in particular? The reasons were forthcoming, logical, and in order. He was a man whom Pollard hated. Already Pollard regretted having sold the Poison Hole ranch for $20,000. He wanted it back. Thornton happened to be a new man in the country, and new men are always open to suspicion. He happened to be close enough to Ben Broderick in size and form and carriage to make the deception easy. And, thought Thornton, there was one other reason. The undertaking of these men had already grown too big, the work too extensive, for it to be handled by 2 men alone. They had confederates. That was inevitable. Blackie, the saloon keeper in Dry Town, was one of them, he felt sure. The Bedloe boys, always ready for deeds of wildness and lawlessness, were others. The Bedloe boys hated him as keenly as did Pollard, and they were not the kind to miss an opportunity like this to break even with him. It was noteworthy that he had had no trouble with them since he had shot the Kid's revolvers out of his hands at John Smith's place last winter. They had left him entirely unmolested. The 3 of them who he knew were fearless and hard and vengeful had not sought in any way to punish him. Here was the reason. He went back to Winifred Waverly's letter. She had ended by saying, "I know that Henry Pollard suspects me of knowing more than I have admitted to him. I suppose I did not entirely deceive him about that yellow envelope. He is watching me all the time. That is why I have written this to be ready to give it to you if I get the chance, if I dare not talk with you. Don't try to see me. I am in no danger now, but if you came, if he knew that we were seeing each other, I don't know." At last, when Thornton got up and went to his door, day was breaking. He returned to his table where his lamplight was growing a sickly pale yellow in the dawn, and holding Winifred's letter over the chimney, burned it. He took her other little note from his pocket, and let the yellow flame lick it up. Then, grinding the ashes under his heel, he put out the light and went again to the door. The recent shooting at the Here's House saloon by some man who had stood almost at the cowboy's elbow he had for a little forgotten as he pondered on his own personal danger, and admitted that the case was going to look bad against him in spite of what he might do. But now, for a moment, he forgot his own predicament to become lost in frowning speculation upon the night's crime. He knew that men like the Bedloes, hard men living hard lives, have many enemies. There were the men whom they had cheated at cards, and who had cheated them, with whom they had drunk and quarreled. It was clear to him that any one of a dozen men bearing a grudge against Charlie Bedloe, but afraid to attack in the open any one of these three brothers who fought like tigers, and who took up one another's quarrels with no thought of the right and the wrong of it, might have chosen this method. Yes, this was clear. But one thing was not. The night had passed, and neither the Kid nor Ed Bedloe had called to square with him. He did not understand this, for he did not believe that even their affiliation with Broderick and Pollard would have held the Kid and Ed back from their vengeance now. It was patent that the Kid had leaped to the natural conclusion that he had killed Charlie Bedloe. He understood the emotion which he had seen depicted in the Kid's twisted face as Charlie staggered and fell at his brother's feet. It was a great, blind grief, unutterable, wrathful, terrible, like the unreasoning, tempestuous grief of a wild thing, of a mother bear whose cubs had been shot before her eyes. For the one thing which it seemed God had put into the natures of these men was love, the love which led them to seek no wife, no friend, no confidant outside their own close fraternity. And yet the night had passed, and neither the Kid nor Ed had come. "Something happened to stop them," mused Thornton. "For a few hours only. They'll come. And I'd give $100 to know who the jasper was that put that bullet into Charlie." He went back into his cabin, put his two guns on the table, threw out the cartridges, and for 15 minutes oiled and cleaned. Then, with a careful eye to every shell, he loaded them again. When he once more threw his door open and went outside, his eyes were a little regretful but very, very hard. He was inclined to believe that Winifred was mistaken in judging Ben Broderick's to be the brains of this thing. He thought that he saw Pollard's hand directing. Until now he had fully expected to go to Dry Town, to raise the $4,500 with which to make his last payment upon the Poison Hole ranch. Now he more than suspected that this was but a play of Pollard's to get him out of the way while the last crime be perpetrated, to have him out upon one of his lonely rides so that he could prove no alibi, perhaps even to rob him of the $4,500 before he could come with it to Hill's Corners. Now he made up his mind that he was not going to give Pollard this one last chance he wanted, for he felt convinced if he did succeed in getting through with the money without a bullet in the back, and if he actually brought it to Pollard, the latter would tell him that he had changed his mind, and so the rash act would have been done uselessly. Having no way of holding Pollard to his bargain, he had little wish to make the long ride to Dry Town and back. Thornton, for several days, had planned to ride out to the borders of his range to see his cowboys, giving them full instructions for work to be done during the week which followed in case he should not be able to give more time to them. Now, with a great deal to think about, he was not averse to a solitary day in the saddle. Of late he had noted how the cinch of his working saddle was weakening. Some of the strands had parted even. He should mend it now, but he had no time to lose, and he did have another saddle, which he did not use twice during the years, and which for months now he had not even seen. He had put it out of the way, high up in the loft. He went down to the barn meaning to get it and make the exchange. If he was going to have some hard riding during the coming days, it was as well if he used this saddle, the best he had ever seen. Rather too ornate with its profuse silver chasings and carved leather for every day's use, a heavy Mexican affair with which he had won in a bronco busting competition down in Texas 4 years ago. He came up into the loft, half filled with hay, and went to the far end where the saddle had hung upon its peg. It was gone. He stood staring at the peg in surprise. Surely he had left it here, surely he had not removed it. He tried to think when he had seen it last. And he remembered. It had been 2 or 3 months ago, and he knew that he had left it here. He even remembered the trouble he had had in drawing it up after him through the small trap door. Now where was it? His first suspicion was that one of his men had been using it. But he knew that was impossible. He would have seen it, and moreover one man does not take another man's saddle without saying by your leave. "The thing is worth $300, easy," he muttered. "It would be funny." He went to the loose hay heaped at the wall and began to kick it about, half expecting to have his boot strike against the silver-tipped horn or the heavy tapaderos. And then at last did the swift, certain suspicion of the truth flash upon him. He came upon a small soap box hidden far under the loose hay. He drew it out, whisking away the straw which half filled it. After the first start of amazement and a swift examination of the contents, he understood. "A plant!" he cried angrily. "A damned cowardly plant! Lord, Lordy, but they're making a clean job of this!" Upon the top of the pile the first thing he took into his hands was a heavy silver watch. It bore a name, scratched within the case, and the name was that of Jed McIntosh, the man who, Blackie had told him, had been cleaned out in Dry Town. There were 2 bank notes, one for $10, one for $20, and both were soiled with dark smears that told of dry blood. There was a little, much-worn memorandum book with many pencil-scribbled entries in it, and upon the fly-leaf it bore the name of Seth Powers, the man who had been robbed in Gold Run and who had been found beaten into unconsciousness. There was a small tin can, in the bottom of it some pine pitch, and adhering to the pitch a fine sifting of gold dust. A can, he knew, Ben Broderick would identify as the one of which he had been robbed. There were other articles, 2 more watches, a revolver, an empty purse, which he could not identify, but which he realized keenly would be identified when the time came. Suppose that the time came now. Suppose that he should hear the sheriff's voice calling upon him, that a posse should come upon him and find him with this box in his possession. What chance would he have? His face went white with the anger which surged up within him, and the desire leaped up, strong and bitter, To get in his two hands the man who had framed him and to choke the treacherous life out of him. Then, suddenly, he was cool again, seeing the present danger and the urgent need of prompt action. First he made certain that there was no other damning bit of false evidence concealed in the hay or anywhere in the loft. Then, taking the box under his arm, he went down into the stable. Here again he made careful search, spending an hour in a stubborn search. Then, leaving the box in a manger, straw-covered, he went back to the cabin on the top of the knoll. His eyes, running to the 4 points of the compass, told him that there was no other man within sight. Taking off his boots and socks, he waded out into the middle of Big Little River, carrying a shovel and the box. In the soft, sandy soil he made a hole deep enough to hold the box, which he put into it. Swiftly he filled it with stones, placed a big flat rock over it, saw that there was no sign of his work as the sand and mud drifted in to fill the little hollow, and then went back for his boots. The shovel he put again against the bunkhouse wall. When at last he had mended his cinch and rode Comet out towards the east and the mountains upon the flank of the Poison Hole, he had made up his mind what he was going to do. "It's a gamble," he told himself coolly, "but I guess I've got to gamble now. And I'm going to play it heavy." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of 6 Feet 4 by Jackson Gregory. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Jimmie Squares Himself. A horseman was riding toward him upon the far bank of the Big Little River, where it straightened out beyond the cabin. He recognized the horse, and a moment later the rider now waving his hat to him, and knew that it was Two-Hand Billy Comstock returning. He turned and rose slowly to meet the officer. "Back already, Comstock?" he called carelessly. "What luck?" "Bully luck," grinned Comstock, replacing his hat and looking as fresh and well groomed as though he were but this minute up from bed and a long sleep. "First, let me tell you the news." He slipped his hand into his breast pocket and took out an envelope. "More mail for you, Thornton. You're doing a big correspondence, it seems to me." In spite of him, a quick flush ran up to Thornton's brow, for his first thought was that Winifred Waverly— "Wrong guess, Buck," chuckled Comstock, his good humor seemingly flowing from an inexhaustible source. "It's from a man." "Who?" demanded Thornton sharply, putting out his hand. Comstock's amusement welled up into open laughter. "It's a prime joke of the fates," he cried cheerfully. "Here is William Comstock, United States Deputy Marshal, carrying a message from no less a person than Jimmie Clayton, jailbird, crook, and murderer. A man wanted in 2 states." "Clayton?" said Thornton in amazement. "You don't mean to tell me—" "Oh, he'd never seen me, you know, nor I him. But then I've seen his picture more than once, and I know all about him. He's keeping low, but he took a chance on me. I was just a whiskey drummer last night, you know, and happened to let it out that I was riding this way this morning on my way to Dry Town. So Jimmie slipped me the letter. Read it." Thornton took it, wondering. The envelope was sealed and much soiled where Jimmie Clayton's hand had closed the mucilaged flap. He tore it open and read almost at a glance. "Dear Buck, come down the same place tonight. I want to put you wise. There is some danger to you, Buck. Keep your eyes open on the way. I will be there late tonight. J.C." Thornton looked up to see the twinkling eyes of Two-Hand Billy Comstock watching him. "You had better tell me what he says," said Comstock coolly. "I don't know but that I should have been well within my rights to open it, eh? But I hate to open another man's private mail." Thornton hesitated. He must not forget that Comstock was an officer, that even now he was upon a state errand, that it was his duty to bring such men as Jimmie Clayton to justice. He must not forget that Clayton had been a friend to him, or, at least, that he had credited the crook with the feeling of friendship and the care of a friend. True, Comstock, who seemed to know everything, had said in a matter-of-fact way that it had been Jimmie Clayton who had shot him that night between Juarez and El Paso. But nothing was proven. He had long thought of Clayton as a man to whom he owed a debt of gratitude, and now, with the man, hunted as he was, his sympathy naturally went out to him, evil-doer as he knew him to be. Evidently Comstock read what was passing in the cowboy's mind. "I'm not asking you to squeal on him, Buck," he said quietly. "Look here, I could have taken him in last night if I had wanted to. I could have got him a week ago if I had wanted him. But I didn't want him. I don't want him now. I'm hunting bigger game." Still Thornton hesitated, but now his hesitation was brief. He swung his horse around toward the cabin. "Let's ride back, Comstock," he said shortly. "I want a good long talk with you." Not another word about the matter did either man say as they unsaddled, or as they went up the knoll to the cabin. Not a word until the fragrance of boiling coffee and frying bacon went out to mingle with the freshness of the new day. Then as they sat at table and Comstock began to soak the biscuits Thornton had made in the bacon gravy, they looked at each other and their eyes were alike, grave and equally stern. "First thing," began Comstock, "let me finish my news. Charlie Bedloe was murdered last night." "I know." "The devil you do! All right. Then here's something else. His brother, the Kid they call him, swears that you killed him." "I know," nodded Thornton as quietly as before. Comstock made no pretense of hiding his surprise. "I thought you had left before the shooting happened." "I was all over town. No one saw you." "Except the Kid. He did. He saw me outside the window through which somebody shot Charlie." Comstock returned his attention to his biscuit and gravy. "I'm a failure as a newsmonger," he grunted. "Go on, you tell me." And Thornton told him. Before he had finished, Comstock had pushed back his chair and was letting his coffee go cold. For Thornton had told him not alone of what had happened at the Here's House saloon last night, but of the work that Broderick and Pollard were doing, of all his certainties and his suspicions, of the planted evidence he had found in the hayloft, of the missing saddle. Only he did not mention the name of a girl, and he remembered that Pollard was her uncle and spared him where he could. "What a game! By high heaven, what a game!" Comstock pursed his lips into a long whistle. Then he banged his fist down upon the table, his eyes grown wonderfully bright and keen, crying softly, "I've got him! I've got him at last, and he's going to pay to the uttermost for what he has done in the last 7 years, and before. Got him, by thunder!" "Pollard?" asked the cowboy quickly. "No, not Pollard." "Then Broderick?" "Not Broderick." "Bedloe, the Kid?" "What does his name matter? I'll give him a dozen names when the time comes. And by heaven he's got a crime to pay for every name he has ever wore." He grew suddenly silent and sat staring out through the open door at the distant mountains. At last he turned back toward Thornton, his eyes very clear, his expression placid. "Guess why they are waiting 5 days more before springing their mine?" he asked abruptly. "Yes, I figured it out a little while ago, after I found the truck in my loft. In 5 days it'll be the first of the month. On the first of the month, the stage from the Rock Creek mines will be worth holding up. It carried in $10,000 last month. At times there has been a lot more. Just as sure as a hen lays eggs, it is due to be robbed on the first. They'll find something here to prove I was the hold-up man, and And you go over the road for life or take a drop at the end of a rope? And they quit being bad men and buy ranches? That's it?" "That's it. It's a gamble, but—" "But it's a damned good gamble," laughed Comstock softly. "You ought to be sheriff, Buck." But Buck, thinking of how blind to all this he had been so long, how not even now would he have his eyes open were it not for a girl, longed with an intense longing for the end of this thing when she might be free to go from the house of a man like Henry Pollard, when he might be free to go to her, and— "How does it happen," he asked suddenly, "that you are not after Jimmie Clayton?" "When I'm out for a big grizzly," returned Comstock, "I can't waste my time on little brown bears. That's one thing. Another is that Jimmie Clayton never had a chance of getting away. If he lives 10 days he'll be nabbed, and he won't live 10 days. He's shot to pieces, and he's sick on top of it. I told you last night the poor devil is a fool and a tool rather than a real bad man. If he's got a chance to die quietly, why, let him die outside of jail. It's all one in the end." Thornton had always felt a sort of pity for Jimmie Clayton. It had always seemed to him that the poor devil was merely one of the weaker vessels that go down the stream of life, borne this way and that by the current that sweeps them on, with little enough chance from the beginning, having come warped and misshapen from the hands of the potter. And now Jimmie was about to die. Well, whether it had been Jimmie Clayton or another man who had shot him that night down in Texas, he would heed the entreaty of the letter and go to him for the last time. So that night, when darkness came, Thornton left Comstock at the cabin and rode out towards the mountains, towards the Poison Hole and the dugout at its side. It was dark, but not so dark as last night, there being no clouds to blot out the stars. And the moon was slipping upward through the trees upon the mountain top, when Thornton came at last to the lake. As before, he was watchful and alert. Clayton was Kid Bedloe's friend, and Clayton had always struck him as a man in whom one could put little faith. It was quite in keeping with what he knew that Jimmie's note had been written at the instigation of Kid Bedloe himself, and that he was to be led out here where Kid Bedloe and Ed might be in waiting for him. It was quite possible, even probable, but he thought it more than likely that for once Jimmie Clayton was acting in good faith. The Jimmie Clayton whom he found alone a little after moonrise was very much as he had found him that other night. The fugitive lay upon the bunk in the darkness of the dugout, and only when he was assured that it was Buck Thornton come to him did he light his stub of candle. As before, Thornton entered and closed the door after him, to look down on the man with a sharp twinge of pity. "How are they coming, Jimmie?" he asked gently. "Can't you see?" replied Clayton with a nervous laugh. "I'm all in, Buck. All in." If ever a man looked to be "all in," it was poor little Jimmie Clayton. He threw back his coat for Thornton to see. There upon the side was the stain of blood hardly dry upon the shirt. His eyes were hollow, sunken, fever-filled, his cheeks unthinkably drawn, yellow-white and sticky. The hand which fell back weakly from the exertion of opening his coat showed the bones thrust up as though they would pierce the skin. "You've been shot again?" demanded the cowboy. Jimmie shook his head. "The same old hole, Buck. Colt 45. It won't heal up. It breaks out all the time. I can't sleep with it. I can't eat. I can't set still." He had begun manfully, but now the little whimper came back into his voice. His shaking hand gripped Thornton's arm feebly, and he cried tremulously, "I wisht I was dead, Buck. Honest to God, I wish I was dead." "Poor little old Jimmie," Thornton muttered, just as he had muttered the words once before, gently, pityingly. "Is there anything I can do, Jimmie?" Jimmie drew back his hand and lay still for a little, his eyes seeming unnaturally large as he turned them upwards, filled at once with a sort of defiance at an abject, cringing terror. "Nothin'," he said a little sullenly. His eyes dropped and ran to the fingers of his hand which were plucking nervously at his coat. He parted his lips as though he would say something else, and then closed them tightly. Even his eyes shut tight for a moment. Thornton watched him, waiting. It was easy to see that Jimmie Clayton had upon the tip of his tongue something he wished to say, and that he hesitated, through fear. "What is it, Jimmie?" Thornton asked after a while. Jimmie lifted his head quickly. His eyes flew open with a look in them almost of defiance as he blurted out, "Do you know who shot you, that time down in Juarez?" "Was it you, Jimmie?" asked Thornton. Jimmie's eyes grew larger. All defiance fled from them and the terror came back. You think," he faltered, "you thought all along—" "Was it you, Jimmie?" The voice was soft, the eyes gentle, and now a little smile accompanied the words. It was so easy to forget what had happened so long ago, to disregard it when one looked into this man's eyes and saw there the end of the earthly sort of a man who had not been a good man because he had never had a chance, who had never really earned his spurs as a Western bad man because he was of too small caliber, who was after all a vessel that had come imperfect from the hands of the potter. Now Jimmie answered, his voice hushed, his eyes wide, his soul filled with wonderment. "It was me, Buck." "Well, Jimmie, I'm sorry. But it can't be helped now, can it? And I'll forget it if you will." He looked at the worn, frail form and knew that Comstock was right and that little Jimmie Clayton was lying in the valley of the shadow of death. So he added, his voice very low and very gentle, "I'll even shake hands if you will, Jimmie." Jimmie closed his eyes, but not quick enough to hide the mistiness which had rushed into them. His breathing was irregular and heavy, its sound being the only sound in the dugout. He did not put out his hand. Finally, his voice steadier than it had been before, he spoke again. "You've been square with me, Buck. I want to be square with you. There's a frame-up to get you. Now, don't stop me, and I'll talk as fast as I can. It hurts me to talk much." He pressed a thin hand upon his side, paused a moment, and then went on. I think Broderick's the man as has been putting over most of the stick-ups around here for quite some time. Him and Pollard in together. I ain't squealing on a pal when I tell you this, neither," with a little flash of his old defiance. "Broderick's no pal of mine, a dirty cur. He could have got me clear. He wanted to make 'em give me up, to get the reward. Their game is to make folks think you been doing these things, and to send you up for 'em." He stopped to rest, but even now did not look to see what effect his words had upon his hearer. "I don't know much about it," he went on after a moment. "You can find out. But I do know they stole a saddle of yours, and a horse. They're going to stick up the stage out of Rock Creek Mines next week. There's going to be some shooting, and a horse is going to get killed. That'll be your horse, Buck, and it'll have your saddle on." He had told his story. He told nothing of how he knew, and Thornton did not press him, for he guessed swiftly that somehow the telling would implicate Kid Bedloe, who was a pal, and little Jimmie Clayton was not going to squeal on a pal. Half an hour after he had come to the dugout, Thornton left it, for Clayton could not talk further and would not let him stay. "I got a horse out there," he said irritably. "I can get along. I'm going to move on in the morning. So long, Buck." So Thornton went back to his horse, wondering if, when tomorrow came, Jimmie Clayton would not indeed be moving on like little Joe to the land where men will be given an even break, where they will be given their chance. His foot was in the stirrup when he heard Clayton's voice calling. He went back into the dugout. The light was out and it was very dark. "What is it, Jimmie?" he asked. "I was thinking, Buck," came the halting answer, "that, if you don't care, I will shake hands." Thornton put out his hand a little eagerly, and his strong fingers closed tightly upon the thin, nervous fingers of Jimmie Clayton. Then he went on without speaking. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of 6 Feet 4 by Jackson Gregory. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. The Showdown. Upon the first day of the month, the stage leaving the Rock Creek Mines in the early morning carried a certain long, narrow lockbox carefully bestowed under the seat whereon sat Hap Smith and the guard. Also a single passenger, a swarthy little man with ink-black hair plastered down close upon a low, atavistic forehead and with small, ink-black eyes. In Dry Town, beyond the mountains, to which he was evidently now returning from the mines, he was known as Blackie, bartender of the Last Chance saloon. This morning he had been abroad as early as the earliest. He seemed to take a bright interest in everything, from the harnessing of the 4 horses to the taking on of mail bags and boxes. In a moment when Hap Smith, before the mine superintendent's cabin, was rolling a cigarette preparatory to the long drive, Blackie even stepped forward briskly and gave the guard a hand with the long, narrow lockbox. Keen-eyed and watchful as Blackie was, he failed to see a man who never lost sight of him or of the stage until it rolled out of the mining camp through the early morning. The man, unusually tall, wearing black shaggy chaps, gray soft shirt, and neck handkerchief, and a large black hat, kept the stage in view from around the corner of the woodshed standing back of the superintendent's cabin. Then, swinging up to the back of a rangy granite-colored roan, he turned into the road. "We're playing to win this time, Comet," he said softly. "And as we said all along, Blackie's the capper for their game. Shake a foot, Comet, old boy. Maybe at the end of a hard day's work we'll look in on her." When, an hour later, the stage made its brief stop at Miller's Flat to take on mail bags, Blackie was leaning out smoking a cigar and looking about him alertly. A lounger near the post office door turned to watch in great seeming idleness. His eyes met the bartender's for a second, and he nodded casually. "How's everything?" he asked in the customary inconsequential manner of casual acquaintanceship. "Fine," said Blackie in a tone of equal casualness. "Couldn't be better." The stranger slouched on his way, climbed into the saddle of the horse he had left by the door, and rode off. And Buck Thornton, from the bend in the road where he had halted Comet under a big live oak tree, noted how the horseman rode on his spurs when once he had passed from the sight of the stage driver. "Taking the Red Cañon trail," he marked with satisfaction. "Carrying the word to Broderick and Pollard that there's been no slip-up, and that the box is really aboard. And now, shake a foot, Comet. Here's where we put one over on Blackie." The man who had passed the time of day with the saloon man had disappeared over a ridge and out of sight. Thornton consequently rode swiftly to overtake the stage. Before the 4 running horses had drawn the creaking wagon after them a half-mile, Hap Smith stopped his horses in answer to the shout from behind him and stared over his shoulder wonderingly. "What the hell?" he began. And then with a shade of relief in his tone and yet half hesitatingly, the frown still on his face as Thornton rode close up, "It's you, is it? I thought for a minute—" "That it was Broderick?" laughed Thornton. "You didn't think so, did you, Blackie?" Blackie drew back and slipped his hand covertly into his coat pocket. Thornton, giving no sign that he had seen, said briefly to Hap Smith, "You've talked things over with Banker Templeton? And with Comstock?" "Yes," said Hap Smith, his thick, squat figure growing tense where he sat, as though with a sudden nervous bracing within. "Yes." "And you expected me here? You will give me a free hand?" "Yes," cried Smith ringingly. "Damn 'em, yes. Go to it, Buck." Thornton turned stern eyes upon Blackie. "I can shoot 12 holes through you before you get your hand out of your pocket," he said crisply. "You damned stool pigeon. Now suppose you pull your hand out, empty, and stick it up high above your head. Think it over, Blackie, before you take any fool chances." His left hand held Comet's reins gathered up close as he spoke. His right rested lightly on the horn of his saddle. Blackie plainly hesitated. A tinge of red warmed his swarthy cheek. His eyes glittered evilly. Then suddenly he whipped out his hand, a revolver in it. But Thornton, for all of the handicap, fired first. His own right hand went its swift, sure way to the gun swinging loose on its holster under his left armpit. He jabbed it forward, even as he swung himself to one side of the saddle, and fired. The revolver slipped from Blackie's hand and clattered down to the bed of the wagon, while Blackie, crying out chokingly, his face going white with fear, clutched at his shoulder and gave up the fight. With scant time allowed in their plans to waste on such as Blackie, he was made to lie down in the bottom of the wagon, his wrists bound, his wound very rudely bandaged, his body screened from any chance view by the boxes and mail bags, and a handkerchief jammed into his mouth. Within 10 minutes Hap Smith was clattering on, his and the guards' mouths and eyes grim and hard, and Thornton had again dropped behind, just out of sight around the first bend in the road. "And now, my boy," muttered Hap Smith to his friend, the guard, "keep both eyes peeled and your trigger finger free. Hell's goin' to pop in considerable less'n no time." Nor was the stage driver unduly pessimistic. Half an hour after Blackie had gone down among boxes and bags, the lumbering vehicle thundered into one of the many deep gorges through which the narrow road wound. Here was a sharp turn and a bit of steep grade to take on the run if the stage were to keep to scheduled time. But suddenly, and with a curse from Smith and a sharp exclamation from the guard, Hap slammed on his brake. A newly fallen pine tree, 3 feet thick, lay across the road. The guard's rifle was ready in his hands. In a flash, Hap Smith had dropped his reins so that they were held only by the ring caught over the little hook at the back of the seat, and had whipped out his own big ugly revolver. His eyes ran this way and that. In his soul he knew well enough that no mere bit of chance had thrown the obstruction across his way. But never a head nor an arm nor a rifle barrel rewarded his look, until suddenly, heralded by a curt shouted command, a man rode out into the open road from the mouth of a cañon. "Don't be a fool, Smith. Take a look around first." It was a voice eminently cool and steady and insolent. Though his gun rose slowly, Hap Smith heeded the note of arrogance, and, with a hard finger crooked to the trigger, looked about him again. And this time not in vain. Yonder, from across the top of a boulder, a rifle barrel bore unwaveringly upon the breadth of his chest. 10 feet higher up on the mountainside, where there was a pile of granite rocks and a handful of scrub brush, a second rifle gave its sinister silent warning. 2 other guns looked forth from the other side of the road. In all, at least 5 armed men. Hap Smith's eyes went back to the man sitting his horse in the middle of the road just across the fallen pine tree. A tall, powerfully built man dressed quite as Hap Smith and the guard had been told to expect. Black, shaggy chaps, gray shirt and neck handkerchief, broad black hat, red bandana across his face with wide slits for the eyes. And yet both of the men in the stage stared and were on the verge of uncertainty. Had they not been prepared, both would have sworn that it was Buck Thornton on Buck Thornton's horse, and later they would, no doubt, have sworn to Buck Thornton's saddle. 5-2 seemed the odds, with all of the highwaymen saving the one bold figure screened from view, and so holding the advantage of position. And yet for once the odds were not what they seemed. For now there came abruptly, and utterly with no sign of warning, the answer to the last big play of Ben Broderick and Henry Pollard and the rest. Into the road out of the same cañon from which the masked man on the horse had come, now rode 2 more men, side by side, and with a thunderous racket of pounding hoofs beating at rocky soil, their heads up, their faces unhidden, their eyes hard and bright, and their right hands lifted a little. 2-Hand Billy Comstock and Buck Thornton come at the top speed of a swinging gallop to alter the odds and take a hand. And as Thornton's horse's hoofs struck in the dust of the road, and the masked rider swung about, startled in the moment of his supreme arrogant confidence, It looked to those who saw as if there came Buck Thornton on the one big gray horse racing down upon another Buck Thornton on that big gray's mate, with but 100 yards between them. "Pull the rag off your face, Broderick!" shouted Thornton savagely. And oddly enough, Ben Broderick, with a swift realization that a bandana hiding his face now could no longer befriend him, and might flap across his eyes at a time when he should see straight and quick, yanked it away. And with the same gesture he jerked his lifted gun down and started firing, straight at Thornton. Of the 5 rifles trained upon those in the stage, not a one was silent now. Hap Smith jumped to his feet and fired as fast as he could work the trigger. The man at his side leaped down into the road, crouched at the wagon wheel, and poured shot after shot into the brush whence he had seen the muzzles of 2 guns. Before Ben Broderick's pistol had broken the silence, Buck Thornton had fired from the hip, and Two-Hand Billy Comstock, his reins on his saddle horn, was freshening his right to his title, firing with one gun after the other in regular mechanical fashion. Hap Smith was the first man down. He toppled, steadied himself, fired again, and collapsed, sliding down against the dashboard and thence to the ground. His horses had plunged, leaped, and in a tangle of straining harness tugged this way and that a moment, and then, with the stage jerking and toppling after them, went down over a 6-foot bank and into the thicket of willows along the creek bed. With them went Blackie, his face showing a moment gray with fear. Hap Smith, alive simply because the trampling horses had whirled the other way, lifted himself a 6 inches from the roadbed, struggled with his gun, and fainted. The guards saw a head exposed from behind a tree and sent a .30-30 rifle ball crashing through it. On the instant another bullet from another quarter compacted with his own body, and he went down, shot through the shoulder. Thornton's eyes were for Ben Broderick alone, and it would seem Broderick's for Thornton. But in their expression there was nothing of similarity. In Thornton's was a stern readiness to mete out punishment, while from Broderick's there looked forth a sudden furtiveness, a feverish desire for escape. Broderick had never drawn to himself the epithet of coward. But now he knew what he was doing, where wisdom pointed, and what was his one chance. There was still a good 50 yards between him and the man who rode down upon him, a long shot for a revolver when the horses which both men bestrode were rearing and plunging wildly. Broderick bent forward suddenly, whirled his horse, drove his spurs deep into the gray's sides, and in a flash had cleared the fallen log, shot around the bend in the road, and taking his desperate chance with all of the cool defiance of danger which was part of the man, sent his mount leaping down the steeping bank, into the willow thicket, and on across. Shouting mightily and wrathfully, after him came Buck Thornton. But Broderick had the few yards head start, and for the moment his destiny was with him. Thornton saw only a thicket of willows wildly disturbed as Broderick went threshing through them, and knew that for the present, at least, Broderick was beyond pursuit. Swinging about angrily, he rode back to join Comstock. Already the battle there in the cañon was over, the smell of powder was gone from the still air, the last reverberating echo of a shot had died away. And in the road lay 3 men, 2 of them severely wounded, while the other was already dead. Stooping over this man, a queer look in his eyes, stood Comstock. I hankered to bring him in alive," he muttered. "But, after all, it's just as well. And it had to be him or me." "Pollard?" asked Thornton quickly. But Comstock shook his head. Then Thornton, riding close, looking down from the saddle, saw the white upturned face. This time, as his eyes came back to Comstock nodded. "Cole Dalton, sheriff," he said gravely. "Yes. And he's the man I came all this way to gather in, Buck. I've been after him for 7 years, never guessing until lately that he was out here working the old Henry Plummer game of sheriff and badman at the same time. He's kept under cover, that being always his way. You'd never have thought that Pollard, Broderick, Bedloe were all tools. But I got him, Buck, at last." A moment only Thornton stared incredulously. Then his shoulders twitched, as though this was a matter which could not concern him at present, and he had other things to think of. "Pollard?" he asked shortly. "Over yonder." Comstock nodded toward the patch of brush on the mountainside. "Shot through the head." "And the others? One was the Kid, wasn't it?" But now the Kid answered for himself. He rose to his knees among the stunted manzanita bushes not 20 steps from them, and for a moment knelt there, his big, bulky body wavering as he tried to bring his rifle to rest at his shoulder, his eyes peering out wildly from a blood-smeared face. But his gesture was awkward and slow and uncertain. He was too badly hurt to shoot straight or quick, and Thornton, swift and sure and yet merciful withal, was before him. The Kid's rifle clattered to the ground. The Kid's left arm, the bone broken, dropped uselessly to his side. He tried to steady the gun with his one good arm alone, but it shook hopelessly. He dropped it and turned bloodshot eyes on Thornton. "Damn you," he said tonelessly. "Better do a clean job, you white-livered coward, or I'll see you hang yet for killing Charlie." "I was outside when he was shot," said Thornton coolly. "I saw just as much as you did. Somebody shot him from behind me." "Liar!" jeered Bedloe. "And—" "Don't be a fool, Bedloe," snapped Comstock. "The man you want is the same man we want. Only the other day he had a quarrel with Charlie and got a bullet alongside the head." "Not Ben Broderick!" gasped the Kid stupidly. "Not him!" "I think your little friend Jimmie Clayton knew," said Comstock. "And you ought to know that Thornton isn't that kind." With widening eyes the Kid stared at him. At last he got again to his knees, finally and shakily to his feet. "Jimmie told me to watch him," he muttered thickly. "And him and Charlie did have words." He stared at them stupidly, hesitated, pondered the matter. Then he turned and went lumbering down the road. Comstock, stepping forward swiftly, called out, "I say, Bedloe, none of that!" But Bedloe neither turned again nor paused. Thornton's hand shut down hard on Comstock's arm. "He's going after Broderick," he said sharply. "Don't you see? He'll know where Broderick is. And we don't. Besides, I don't know just why we should stop him. If Broderick did kill Charlie—" Comstock went back to administer to Hap Smith and the guard. Thornton watched the Kid go to a horse hidden in a clump of trees. Then, as Bedloe rode down into the road and passed on whither it led, sitting slumped forward, and seeming at each step about to fall, Thornton rode after him. The Kid did not so much as look around. Perhaps it mattered to him not in the least, just then, who followed or how many, so that they left him to ride on ahead. It was straight into the town of Dead Man's Alley that the Kid's way led. The high sun glared down into a deserted street when he and Buck Thornton, 100 yards behind him, passed by the Here's How Saloon and the Brown Bear, and at last drew rein at Henry Pollard's gate. A couple of men at the lunch counter stared curiously after the Kid. They even got down hastily from their high stools and stared more curiously still when they saw who it was who followed. "They've rode hard, them two," said one of the men thoughtfully. "Their horses is all in." "The Kid ahead and Buck Thornton followin'," grunted the other musingly. "And the Kid never lookin' around." He shook his head, and long after both of the riders had passed out of sight down the crooked street, these two men looked after them wonderingly. At Pollard's gate the Kid dismounted stiffly. Now, for the first time, Thornton came up to him. "If you think Broderick's in there," he said sharply, "you'd better let me go ahead. You're in no shape, Bedloe." "You go to hell," said Bedloe heavily. "He's mine." He stepped forward and pulled open the gate. Here he paused just long enough to drag his revolver from the holster at his hip. With the weapon in his hand, swaying in his long strided walk, he went to Pollard's front door. Just behind him, almost at his heels, came Thornton. As he tried the door cautiously, the Kid looked over his shoulder with a show of teeth. "He's mine," he snarled again. "You keep your hands off." Thornton offered no answer. The Kid, having ascertained that the door was locked, drew back, steadied himself with his hand against the wall, lifted his foot, and with all of the power in him, drove his heavy boot against the lock. Something broke, the panel splintered, the door gave a little, but only a little. The heavy bar which Henry Pollard used was in its place. "Again," said Thornton. "Together. Quick." So, together, Buck Thornton and Kid Bedloe, two men who had long hated each other, struck savagely at Pollard's barricade. And such was the weight of the two men, such the power resident in the two big bodies, that a hinge gave, and after it an iron socket screwed to the wall was torn away from the woodwork, and the door went down. Gathering all there was of strength left in him, Kid Bedloe pushed to the fore and went down the hall, and Thornton followed at his heels. In this fashion they came to the door of Pollard's study and saw through it, since it had been flung wide open and so left. In a far corner of the room was Winifred Waverly, her face dead white, her body pressed tight into the angle of the walls, her hands twisting before her, her eyes going swiftly to the two entering figures from that other figure which had held her fascinated. Upon the floor, just rising, knelt Ben Broderick. He had tossed a rug aside and had lifted out the short sections of a half a dozen strips of flooring, disclosing a rude wooden vault below. Here was the accumulation of loot. Here where the Kid had known Broderick was to be found. For a very brief yet electrically vital and vivid moment there was no sound in the room, wherein never a single muscle twitched. And then there were no words, and only 3 sharp pistol shots. Broderick had seen what lay in the Kid's eye, a look to be read by any man. He had snatched his gun up from the floor beside him and had fired, point blank. There is no name for the brief fragment of time between his shot and the Kid's, but Ben Broderick had shot true to the mark, and the Kid was sinking. Bedloe's bullet had gone wide. And then the third shot, Thornton's. And as the two men fell, Kid Bedloe and Ben Broderick, they pitched forward toward the center of the room, and the big body of the Kid lay across the body of Ben Broderick. As the Kid died, his eyes were upon Thornton, and in them was a look of content and of gratitude. "Again he tried to kiss me. He is all brute. He told me you were dead. Oh, dear God, dear God!" cried the girl, shrinking back, covering her face with her hands. Thornton, his face set and white and grave, came to her. She was trembling so that he put his arm about her. She sobbed and caught at him as a child might have done. His arm tightened, holding her close. "Let me take you away," he said gently. With never a look back to see what long hoarded booty there in the hole in the floor had drawn Ben Broderick back to Pollard's house, he turned and with his arms still about her led the girl from the room, from the house, and out to his horse at the fence. She moaned again and drooped against him. He gathered her up into his arms tenderly, and with a tenderness which was to become part of the man, he held her close while he swung slowly into the saddle. "Winifred Waverly," he began. There he stopped, looking with puzzled eyes down into her white face. God knew how much she had gone through, what fear Ben Broderick had put into her heart. But at the least now she had fainted. "She's all alone," muttered the cowboy. "All alone, and somebody's got to look out for her." He turned slowly and rode down the crooked street, carrying her lightly in his arms. And now, more than ever, did the two men at the lunch counter stare. The End. End of Chapter 28. End of 6 Feet 4 by Jackson Gregory. This recording has been by Roger Melin.